Hello, hello, hello. I hope you guys are ready to get your geek on with me. It is day 10 of Preptober and we only have 21 days to go till NaNoWriMo, so we had better get to work. In my past few videos, we have talked about choosing a plot, a genre and characters for your novel, but today we are going to be talking about narrative point of view and choosing what point of view your story is going to be told from. So what is narrative point of view? Well, point of view, or POV as it is often shortened to, is essentially the voice through which your story is being told. Basically, who is telling the story. Now you might say, I know who's telling the story, me! To which I would whack you over the head with a rolled up newspaper and tell you that you are very stupid. What I mean is the story being told from an outside perspective, somebody who knows the story but is not part of the story, or is it being told from the point of view of one of the characters in the story? Or could the story even be being told by the reader themselves? Now, there are three primary narrative points of view: first person, second person, and third person. First person narrative is a story in which one of the characters is relating the story from their own point of view. You can tell when a story is written in first person because the author will describe themselves as I drew my sword, I stabbed the dragon in the heart, I threw the beautiful damsel over my shoulder and rode off into the sunset. Now, the narrator of the story does not necessarily need to be the protagonist. For example, the Sherlock Holmes stories are written in first-person point of view, but they are written from the point of view of Watson, which was definitely the right way to go because Sherlock Holmes already knows everything. If we were reading the novel from Sherlock Holmes's point of view, it would just be, a distressed-looking young woman walked through my door, and after one glance at her, I instantly knew what the crime was, who the criminals were, who the victims were, when and where the criminal was going to strike next, and exactly how I was going to stop them. The end. But from Watson's point of view, we get to watch Sherlock Holmes solve the mystery without actually knowing what it is he's figured out, or knowing what's going to happen next. Second-person point of view, on the other hand, is one that is rarely seen in novels and extremely difficult for an author to pull off. This is the point of view in which the reader is the one telling the story. You'll know if you're reading a second-person point of view narrative if the protagonist is referred to as you. You turned off your alarm, you brushed your teeth and got dressed, you went to work. And if you have never read a story like that, I am not surprised, because this form of narrative is very, very rare, because the reader isn't the one telling the story, you're the one telling the story, and the reader doesn't really get a say in what happens. One genre where you are likely to find a second-person point of view narrative, however, is interactive fiction. Back in the 1970s to 90s, there was a series of very popular children's books called Choose Your Own Adventure, in which throughout the story the reader would be given choices such as, if you want to go to the happy magical forest of unicorns and rainbows, turn to page 27. If you want to go to the spooky, terrifying, erupting volcano of doom, turn to page 104. And the reader would get a completely different story depending on the choices that they made. Interactive fiction is making a comeback, both in novel form and more prominently in the form of ebooks and computer games, as a computer has a much better ability to track the player's choices throughout the story, and you can add things like stats and an inventory that a normal paper book wouldn't be able to include. I personally have written quite a few interactive fiction stories myself, and I must say it is a very fun genre to write in. I highly recommend it. And finally, we have third-person point of view, the most common form of narrative point of view that you will find in literature, in which the novel is being told from an outside perspective. Characters throughout the novel will be referred to as he, she, or they. They are not people that the narrator knows personally, the narrator is just telling you a story about them. Authors can also combine different points of view in their narrative. For instance, you can have a kind of story within a story, where the story is objectively being told in third-person narrative, but somewhere within the story, one of the characters starts narrating their own story, and the narrative changes to first-person point of view. The Name of the Wind is a good example of using both third and first-person narrative within the same novel. Also, sometimes the author will write a story from different characters' point of view, where some characters are written in first-person narrative and others are written in third-person narrative. It happens sometimes in romance novels, where, for example, the story goes back and forth between the male and the female love interests, and the female love interest is written in first person, saying, I did this and I did that, whereas the male love interest is written in third person, saying, he did this and he did that. I personally don't like this style of writing at all. I suppose a talented writer could make it work, but I haven't seen an example that I've liked so far. I do like stories that are told from multiple characters' point of view, but I feel like the narration style should be consistent, like Game of Thrones, where the story is told from multiple characters' viewpoints, but it is always written in third-person narrative. Also, I would very much like to see a novel where the story is told from multiple characters' viewpoints, but it is always written in first-person narrative. I have never come across a novel like this before, but I think it could be extremely interesting, getting into the heads of multiple different characters that all have different thoughts and different goals. So if anybody knows any novels that are written from multiple first-person point of view perspectives, please recommend it to me because I would really like to read that. Now, while there are three main narrative points of view, there are subgenres within those narratives. For example, with third-person point of view, the story can be told in third-person omniscient or third-person limited. What's the difference? Well, third-person omniscient is told by a character who knows absolutely everything. They know everything there is to know about every single one of the characters. They know where all of the characters are and what all of the characters are doing at all times. They can tell you what is happening to Bob on one side of the world, and then in the next chapter they can tell you what is happening to Mary on the other side of the world. They know things the characters themselves don't even know. The narrator is like God. Pretty much they just know everything. With third-person limited, on the other hand, the amount of information that the narrator can give you is, obviously, limited. It's more similar to first-person narrative, as the narrator is usually following the actions of a particular character or characters, and so generally doesn't give you any information outside of what those characters know themselves. If the evil villain has escaped from prison and is hiding out in their evil lair, secretly plotting their revenge, the narrator does not know about it until the character they are following knows about it. This kind of narrative is more popular with authors who want to focus on the thoughts and feelings of a particular character and give the readers a deeper connection to the character that the narrator is following. There are also different kinds of first-person narrative. I'm not sure what the technical term is for these different styles of writing, but I am going to call them first-person memoir, first-person journal, and first-person mental. First-person memoir is where the narrator is actually supposed to be writing the story themselves. At some point in the character's life, they actually sit down with a pen and paper and write this story down. First-person journal is similar to first-person memoir in that the character is supposed to be writing the story themselves, but differs in that with a memoir, the events of the story have already happened and the character already knows everything that is going to happen. With a journal, the character is writing the story down as it develops and they have no idea what is going to happen next. For instance, on day 1, the narrator might write, "I love my husband, he's so perfect, he's the most wonderful man in the world ever." And on day 23, they might write, "My husband has been cheating on me, I'm divorcing him, what a scumbag, he's the biggest piece of crap I have ever met." And both accounts would be true because both would be what the narrator genuinely believes at the time. And a first-person mental perspective would be not necessarily something the narrator is writing, but more what they are thinking and feeling. The story is essentially taking place inside the mind of the narrator. Whilst first-person memoirs are often written in past tense, mental narratives are usually written in present tense. For example, instead of saying, "I went to the store and I bought a pint of milk," the story would say, "I go to the store and I buy a pint of milk." The events of the story are things that are happening to the narrator right now in the present. With first-person narration, you can also play around with things like the narrator's reliability and the narrator's intended recipient. For example, a reliable narrator is just somebody who tells you the story as it happened, whereas an unreliable narrator might not necessarily be telling you the truth. They could be straight up lying, they could be exaggerating the truth, they could be misremembering things, or they could be suffering from some kind of delusion. Either way, with first-person narrative, and sometimes even with third-person narrative, you can't always believe everything the narrator tells you. And then with intended recipient, I am talking about who the novel is directed towards. Often with memoirs, the intended recipient is just the reader. Anybody who happens to pick up a copy of the book is an intended recipient. With a journal, on the other hand, the journal entries are supposed to be private. The narrator is writing the story for themselves alone, and therefore might divulge some very personal thoughts that they would not be writing down if they thought that somebody else might end up reading them. Then there are first-person narratives that are written in the form of a letter. The narrator is writing this novel for a particular person, and that person is not you. They could be writing to a friend, a relative, or a lover, and you, the reader, are sticking your nose into somebody else's personal love letters, you nosy little bastard. This is actually the style that I'm planning on writing my novel in for Nano. I'm writing a character's memoir in first-person narrative, but rather than being written for the general public, it is written for a specific individual, and the readers will not find out who that individual is, probably until the very end. So, how do you decide which POV to write your novel in? Which POV is going to work best for you? Well, first of all, unless you're writing an interactive fiction novel, you can probably rule out second-person POV. The vast majority of writers will be choosing between first-person and third-person narration. When choosing between first and third person, there's a few different factors that you need to take into account. For example, do you want your novel to focus on one character or multiple characters? Novels with multiple protagonists are almost always told from third person POV. Though, like I said, a novel with multiple protagonists that's written in first person from multiple different characters' first person POVs is something that I'd really like to see, so don't rule that idea out. You also need to consider what kind of information do you need to convey to the reader. Are there going to be times throughout the novel where you want the reader to know things that the characters in the novel do not know? In which case, first person wouldn't really work, because with first person narrative you can only really convey the thoughts and feelings of the character who is narrating the story. And do you want your novel to have an unreliable narrator? While it is technically possible to have a third-person unreliable narrator, first-person unreliable narrators are more common. But putting aside the limitations of writing it in any specific POV, the most important thing is what POV feels right to you. How is it that you want to tell your story? A first-person narrative can be really useful for helping your readers feel a really intimate relationship with your narrator, as they can really get into the head of the character and genuinely feel what your narrator feels. Third-person narrative, though, can be really helpful in telling a wider story than just your narrators, and give the reader the option of which character do they relate to the most, who do they really care about. And one way of figuring out which POV works best for you is to simply try writing in different ways. Take a scene from your novel, doesn't have to be a long scene, it could just be a single paragraph, but try to make it an important scene that you know for a fact is going to happen at some point in your novel. And then try writing that scene in multiple different ways. Try writing it in third person omniscient, try writing it in third person limited, try writing it in first person past tense, and then try writing it in first person present tense. If you're feeling really experimental, you could even try writing it in second person with the reader as the protagonist and see if you can somehow make that work. Once you have tried writing the same scene in multiple different ways, read through all of your attempts and ask yourself which writing style feels the most comfortable for you. Which are you most drawn to? Which one fits the tone of the story the best? And that is your homework for today. Weigh up your options when it comes to choosing a POV. Consider the different POVs' strengths and limitations. Experiment with writing a scene in multiple different POVs to figure out which POV feels most comfortable for you, and then make a decision on which POV you are going to use for your novel. In tomorrow's video, we are going to be moving on to the topic of setting. Where is your novel going to be set? Is the novel going to be set in this world or in a fictional world? What time and place is it going to be set in? Is it going to be set in modern times? Is it going to be set hundreds or maybe thousands of years ago? Is it going to be set hundreds or maybe thousands of years in the future? What country and culture is the novel going to be set in? And what kind of atmosphere is the novel's setting going to create for the reader? But that is me done for today, guys. Please let me know what POV you're planning on writing your novel in, and maybe share some examples of the scene you wrote that made you decide that that POV was the right POV for you. Hope I see you guys in the next video, and I hope you all have fun with your writing.